so last time we're looking at a good friend Aristotle talking about habit and virtue, looking at his view of moral education. And in terms of answering some of the key questions, his view of human nature is people are basically neutral. They can become virtuous or become full of vice, but even though we have certain inclinations, basically neutral. In terms of the morality that should be taught, his view is one morality, specifically virtue theory, and the way they teach it is not through, essentially not primarily about talking about it, things that generally won't work, but his view is a practical one. Essentially all means that will bring it about should be attempted. Now, what does he consider in terms of who should be doing the educating? Well, he mentions right at the start it should be the state, and he gives three main arguments as to why the state should be the moral educator. And this is an important issue for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is sort of the theoretical question, theoretically, who would be the best moral educator, or who should do it? And there's also, the practical concern about if we want people to be more educated, how do we bring this about? Then there's also sort of the, moral concern, namely tying into politics, is what should be the role of the state? Since Aristotle says the state should do this, there's a very good question, is this an appropriate role for the state? And with an upcoming election in 2016, the role of the state is always an important part of that election. So let's take a look at what Aristotle had to say about why the state should be choice one. Now the first argument he gives is this. This is basically the youth argument. And what he claims is that, crudely put, is that education and goodness is hard to bring about. Because, again, crudely put, like the classic song, kids just want to have fun. The difficult moral life is not something that most kids, the youth, find appealing. They'd rather be doing things that are more fun. So, why the state? Well, as he sees it, here's the reason. So the first reason is if this activities and so forth is regulated by the state, his argument is that it'll become less irksome as they get older. So to be a little clearer focus, here's the idea. So moral education should be the state. First argument as to why it should be the state is because of the education of the youth. And this is an argument as to also when moral education should occur. And his claim is we should start with the youth because they do not typically wish to be more educated, but he claims that if you get people when they're young, they'll find it less irksome when they get older. They'll become habituated or accustomed to it. And of course, a fair question to ask is, one is that correct? Does that work? And of course, the second fair question is, would that be the right thing to do? Now, interestingly, importantly enough, the odds are that all of us came up through an Aristotle-like system where we were taught, from an early age to get used to things. And we can show this by looking at our, K through 12 and beyond education system. Think back, if you will, perhaps to your first day of school. And probably the first thing you learned was standing in line and then go in the classroom. And then you sit in, rows of seats, and then you learn to be directed by someone else. You learn, raise your hand, to ask questions, etc., to do things. You learn about like hall passes, and then you learn to do work for someone else at their command, even though you might not like it. And most importantly, you learn to sit in really uncomfortable chairs and uncomfortable desks in unpleasant settings. And also, of course, learn how to do work on other people's schedules, work whose value you probably question. What happens? Well, first you don't like it. You're a kid, you're used to running wild and free. But then you're trapped in these rows doing all this work on someone else's schedule, you still probably don't like it. But then year after year it's the same thing. You just sit in rows, you do work, you work on someone else's schedule, ask permission to do stuff, and it keeps going and going, K through 12. Finally you graduate, head off to college, where you sit in rows in not so awesome, well, it's not a bad classroom, but it's not as awesome as like other places. And of course, doing work that you may consider to be not particularly important or useful. And so the lesson we learn basically is, Aristotle pointed out, we learn how to do stuff, and we gradually never learn to really truly love it, but we find it less irksome. We become habituated. And then, of course, we move on to work, where we sit in a cubicle on an uncomfortable desk doing work at someone else's schedule, work we probably don't value or consider important, and then we die. So Aristotle for the win. So yeah, so his first argument, boiling it back, is basically when people are young, they don't want to do this kind of stuff, but if you keep doing it when people are young, they'll become habituated and find it less annoying. Now, it does seem to be effective because we are all products of that system. Then, of course, there's also the question, is that the right thing to do? And people have questioned that. The second argument, the regulation of life. Now, Aristotle notes that it's not enough to be brought up the right way, because if the moral education stopped, say, when someone became an adult, a person may start backsliding and go back into improper ways. So he thinks that even when people are grown up, they have to be kept in their regimen and keep accustoming themselves to it. So it can't just stop in the youth. Why and how? Well, he thinks what we'll need is, in the case of kids, we of course regulate and compel them. In the United States, for example, people are compelled to go to school until they're at least, I believe, 16, and then they can not graduate, but until then, they got to stay in school. And even once people get out, of course, once you graduate, to grow up, or just grow up, you're still not free of the regulation of the law. And so he thinks we need laws to regulate all of life. Why? Well, his claim is that people are more inclined to listen to force, or rather submit to compulsion, than to be swayed by arguments and fine ideals. So his claim is basically that once people are grown up, they need laws to keep regulating them, and the reason why we need the laws is because, well, people are not going to be swayed by arguments and fine ideals. They need compulsive force, the compulsive power of the state. Now, he does think that, sure, he talks about, since the state is doing this, that the legislators, they should encourage people and appeal to their finer feelings in the hopes that people will respond. But he contends further that those who disobey should be punished, and those who can never be reached should be deported. Or so he claims. Now, he does claim that someone who's good will listen to reason and will follow these laws. But someone who is bad, he claims, must be controlled by pain like a beast of burden. So, pretty harsh. Yeah, so his view is that, again, when you're youth, the idea is to raise people in the system until it becomes habitual. Then they find it less annoying, or so he claims. Then once people are adults, they must be compelled by the law, because first, to sort of maintain the training, he used an analogy, Aristotle likes analogies of health. We can use an analogy to health. If someone exercises as a kid, and then just says, well, I turned 18, my body will just maintain itself, with no further exercise. Not true. You have to keep at it. And he also thinks, in terms of why the state must do this, is because people, he claims, for the most part, are not swayed by arguments or fine ideals. They have to be ruled by pain. And a good question is he right about that? Because this ties directly into how we maintain social order. And, there's been a variety of traditional answers, but they tend to boil down to basically force, or, as we saw in Confucius, the idea of you could somehow maintain order by moral force, moral goodness. So what option did we pick? Well, how do we maintain order? Do we have philosophers patrolling the streets who, if someone's doing something wrong, they help out and say, good citizen, consider, if you will, the implications of these actions. Have you not read the works of Immanuel Kant, realizing that each person is an end unto themselves, and such bad behavior should not be done, for you should respect all your fellow citizens as rational beings of moral worth? Or have you considered the work of John Stuart Mill, in which we should consider the good and happiness of all? So please desist from these nefarious deeds and embrace moral goodness. So do we patrol and maintain order with our philosophy corps? You know, Tallahassee Philosophy Department, for example.
No.
We do not. That would make it probably would make a funny sketch on Saturday Night Live. It may be a short-lived half-season TV show, but maybe longer. Maybe half in one episode. Yeah, so we maintain order how? If someone's misbehaving, do we send a moral expert to go and discuss the finer points of ethics with them? No, we use force. Because in argument, someone could just say, you might have to listen to Kant or Mill, but if you got a gun, the people have to listen to the gun. They don't have to listen to it, but if they get shot, they have to pay attention to that. That's not optional. Yeah, so philosophical arguments people can just choose to ignore. Being shot, difficult to ignore. Now there is, of course, the question of, is that how things have to be? Is Aristotle right? Because his view is, a practical one, that people are not swayed by arguments and fine ideals, so if you want to maintain goodness, you've got to use force. You have to treat people essentially like, as he says, literally like animals, like beasts of burden that to be ruled by pain. And we pretty much embrace that. But a good question is the right thing to do, and are there other alternatives? His third and final argument is this, and this actually kind of rolls a few of them together. Again, as he says, to be a good person, we've got to be raised properly, and we've got to be regulated throughout our life. And he thinks the only way to do this is this. We need a system that has two things going for it, at least. Thing one is this. The system has got to have the power to compel. As he notes, an individual who gives orders, who's just an individual, they don't have much in the way of power or compulsion. I mean, we can illustrate this pretty easily. Suppose someone's driving too fast, and then someone, another person, pulls up beside him, red light and says, "Hey, you're going too fast. You should stop doing that." Person's response will be what? "Thank you, fellow citizen. I did not realize the error of my ways. I shall correct my behavior immediately, for I now realize that driving too fast puts myself and others at risk of danger of harm, and that would be wrong." Now, there'd probably be some gestures and some words, or perhaps some exchange of gunfire, depending how serious things get. Yeah, and so in general, unless someone is particularly persuasive or influential, individuals don't have a lot of power. So what we need is an effective compulsive force. And so the idea is that we have, we use primarily the government and police, and they do effective force. Not only of course, do they have guns, etc., but they're also backed up by a system. More police, legal system, courts, etc. So they do have compulsive force. They have the power to make people either obey or suffer accordingly. So thing number one is the state is compulsive force. Roughly put, the state can compel people, and if it fails in the compulsion, then it can punish people. And if that fails, destroy them. Second thing is this. Merely having power for Aristotle is not enough, because that would give the ability to make people do stuff, but of course they can be compelled or coerced into doing the wrong type of stuff. So he thinks what is also needed is what he calls right intelligence or wisdom. And he claims that the state has got that. That the state, in addition to the obvious thing that it's got compulsive force, it's got monopoly on force in the territories, that it also has wisdom, intelligence. Now by this he means, the laws. That if there are good laws, they would have the right sort of guidance. So for Aristotle, the state brings essentially two main things. First, compulsive power, so it can compel people, and if they refuse to be compelled, to punish them until either they compel, or they're deported, or imprisoned, or destroyed. Second thing he claims is, proper laws would have wisdom, intelligence behind them, so the state would provide that guidance. So we would know what to do, the right thing to do, and the state would compel us to do that. Now Aristotle doesn't think that all states, have good laws. accepts, quite clearly that some states have bad laws. And he does know, like, you can have a state with bad laws that enforces them well, which would be a really bad state, or you can have a state with good laws that doesn't enforce them very well, which would be kind of a bad state. But ideally what you need for Aristotle is good laws with a state with the power to enforce them. Now the third thing he considers under guidance is this. He claims, perhaps incorrectly, that people find it less annoying when the state tells them what to do, as opposed to other individuals. Now, people probably do, well, as a matter of fact, people do find it annoying when the state tells them to do stuff or not do stuff they might want to do, but it's, I guess, a psychological thing. Do people find it less annoying being told to do by the state than by individuals? And my guess would probably be, maybe, probably. I mean, for example, people are probably annoyed, like if, the city, for example, tells them they can't burn tires, on their, or have like a, have a fire pit in their yard. But they probably find it more annoying if their annoying neighbor came over and, lectured them on fire pits. So maybe he's right. Maybe we would find the state less annoying than other people. So, a quick recap of the arguments. Why should the state be more educated? Well, reason one, he claims we must be educated in our youth, and the state seems ideal for that. Something we accept here. We have enforced, education K through 12. Secondly, if people are not regulated as adults, they can backslide into, bad behavior, and so they need to be regulated their entire life. And the state is ideal for this because the state has that compulsive power. And then the guidance argument kind of rolls them all together, namely, according to Aristotle, the state has compulsive power, which individuals lack. The state has, allegedly, if it has good laws, the wisdom and practical intelligence to guide people. And thirdly, he claims, people find it less annoying to be compelled by the state. So the state should make us good. Or so it says. So is he right? Should the state be in the business of making us good?
Repeat the question.
Certainly. Aristotle, sees a primary role of the state, not just to, protect us and enforce laws, but to actually make us good, to make us virtuous people. And is he right? Should the state, should in the 2016 elections, should someone stand up and say, Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, what is your position on the state making us good?
Yeah, it should play a role. The state should play a role.
Anyone against it? So we have it. The state should play a role. Done and done. No opposition? Now, what if the state doesn't do its job? Well, he has a backup plan. The backup plan is the parents. And he says that, well, if the state fails, then anyone, in a way it's everybody, could engage in small education, most likely the parents. But it does note in order to engage in this small education, it would require knowledge. And that seems reasonable. For example, we can use an analogy. In our, in our country, we've decided that, at least for now, the state is supposed to provide K through 12 education. We fund it through our taxes, and everyone's supposed to get, K through 12 education at no additional cost. But suppose, the school systems, fell apart, or we didn't have a public school system. Well, in that case, the second choice would be, parents. But in order to teach stuff, in order to teach, say, chemistry or math or history, would the parents have to know that kind of stuff? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you would need knowledge, still would need knowledge of this. So he thinks that the state is the best choice. If the state fails, the parents and pretty much anybody would be the second choice. They need to know what they're doing. So first choice, the state. Failing that, the parents. So a pretty strict system run by the state. And as I mentioned, it's pretty much a system we've got. We have a system of education of the youth. Our entire life is regulated by law. We are compelled through punishments by the state. And whether or not the state is got good laws, that of course is a point of debate. Before moving away from our good dead friend Aristotle to an alternative viewpoint, put forth by our good dead friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anything about Aristotle that needs more Aristotle.
Can you list the 3 types of guidance that you said?
Oh, for the guidance thing?
Yes.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, the first thing for Aristotle is the state has compulsive power, that an individual, lacks the power to compel people, to make them, they'll try to force them to do stuff. In the analogy I gave, if someone's speeding, and I pull up beside them and say, stop speeding, they don't have to listen to me. But if the police pull up and say, stop speeding, the state, through the police, the state has this compulsive power. So thing one is, the state has compulsive power that individuals lack. The second thing is, for Aristotle, he claims that the laws have what he calls a practical wisdom or practical intelligence. That if there are good laws, they tell us what we should do. They give us good guidance, or so he claims. And thirdly, he claims that although people would be annoyed by other citizens telling them what to do, like a neighbor saying, you can't play your music that loud, or you can't do that, he claims we find it less annoying if the state tells us what to do. We find it less irksome, or so he claims. Cool. Okay, anything else? Okay. Now next, dead guy talking about moral education is our good dead friend, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A little background for Jean-Jacques. He was born on June 28th, 1712, in Geneva, Switzerland, and died on July 2nd, 1778. And of course, he's still dead today, although on Halloween he shall once again walk the earth. But it's not true, maybe. He had a pretty rough life. Shortly after he was born, his mother died, and his father took off and left Geneva apparently to avoid prison. Apparently he'd done something, and so he fled. And so poor Jean-Jacques was left all alone in Geneva. Now, despite his inauspicious, start, he ended up becoming a person with some ambition. And during this time period, anybody in the West who had ambition would go to the most important city in the West at this time, which of course was Paris. Yeah, so, I guess a good place to go. Here they have good cheese and stuff. So in 1742, he arrived in Paris, and kind of like in a, rags to philosopher story, which I guess is more rags, he worked a wide variety of jobs, and then eventually became, so famous that he's still mentioned today long after he's dead. Now, he wrote a lot of stuff, so he's a pretty busy writer. One of his works was the Discourse in Arts and Sciences in 1750, his Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, 1754, Discourse on Political Economy, 1755, the New Heloise in 1761. Weirdly enough, many years ago on the route I would take to campus, there was a small structure, like a house store thing with a window, and it had the New Heloise printed across. There's strange stuff inside. And it was never open when I was driving there. No matter what time I was driving, it was just never open. And I always thought about stopping and looking. But I've seen a lot of horror movies, and so I had a pretty good idea what would happen if I stopped there. So I decided to never stop. And then one day I was driving there and it was just gone. And I thought to myself, I'm glad I didn't stop there. But nothing to do with I was curious, but not curious enough to do the horror movie thing, because I've seen enough of them, I know what you don't do. You don't go in that place. If the demons show up and start, running around your house, you say, nice house, I'll move it, and you leave. He also wrote the thing we're concerned with here, MLA or Emile, also known as Education, published in 1762. His biggest claim to fame, though, was The Social Contract, or The Principles of Political Right, in 1762. So what was going on with Jean-Jacques in terms of some background? Well, during the time period he was Jean-Jacquing, and actually throughout all human history of human thought, there's been kind of the debate about whether intellect should be the thing that's we should focus on, or our emotions and passion. We saw in, Immanuel Kant, he's all about, reason. The idea is that morality is not about how you feel about stuff, it's about how you think about stuff, through this rational principle, the categorical imperative. And the similar sort of debate arises about, art. People, for example, Edgar Allan Poe wrote an essay on, philosophy of composition, and he claimed, by going through his own famous poem, The Raven, that people construct art rationally, although they like to pretend that it's all, a fine frenzy of emotion. And of course, our good dead friend Plato contended that poets and artists are insane. They're literally out of their head, and it's all done, with emotions. And there's a similar debate in ethics. Is ethics about intellect knowing the good, or is it about feeling the good, or feeling the bad? Now, in terms of where we put our good dead friend Jean-Jacques, back when he was Jean-Jacquing, he would be on the emotion and passion side. So more about feeling than thinking about it. So on his view, what are people basically like? Because a key part of moral education, the key question there is, what is the nature of people? And he bought into this notion that was popular during this time period called the noble savage, as opposed to the Nobel savage, which is, I think, Al Gore, because he won that Nobel Prize. But here's the idea. This is kind of exemplified in literature. If you've had the English class where you have to go through and read like colonial period literature in like the 1700s, there was this notion, it's sort of the time period between when Europeans first arrived until they realized, hey, there's all kinds of stuff worth taking here. They cast the original inhabitants, well, maybe not the original, because maybe there were people like even before, but the people that were here when the Europeans arrived, they cast them as noble savages. That being they were savages, because they didn't have all the fine European stuff, but they were noble, because they were not corrupted by the cities. One thing that sort of exemplifies this is the works known as the Leather Stockings Tales, which sounds like pornography, but is not. Because it's not about 50 Shades of Grey type of stuff, it's about the leather stockings that the people exploring, people run around the New World wore. So not that. But anyways, one of the most famous examples of this was the story The Last of the Mohicans. And it's also a pretty good movie. It's an older movie, from I think the 80s or 90s, Daniel Day-Lewis, but it's a good movie. And it's sort of in that genre, that ideal of the noble savage, where the people that are there are savages and so forth, but they're noble, again, because they're not corrupted by civilization in the city. And Rousseau, contributed to this and bought into this idea. And so going on.
You said it's called the Mohicans?
Oh, Last of the Mohicans. Yep, Daniel Day-Lewis, probably on the Netflix or the Amazon Prime, definitely on BitTorrent somewhere, because everything's on the BitTorrent somewhere. I did not say that. I mean, of course, get a legal copy, because it's a good movie, and good stuff is worth paying for. This is, except for this is not totally fair. So what is the noble savage? Well, he extends this to everybody. And there's this notion, we saw a little bit of it with Hobbes, but during the time period when Jean-Jacques was Jean-Jacquing, and we'll see more when we get to part 4, of the state of nature. It's essentially supposed to be like either a theoretical thing or the time before civilization. The idea before we had government and police and so forth. And his claim is that in this state of nature, before we had government and civilization, it was just people in the natural world, that people were noble savages, that they were good. So the question is, if we're born basically good, humans are naturally good, how do we become bad? And that's one of the challenges, is if we believe people are naturally good, we have to have a story of, badness, of corruption. And his answer is this, and it's something that's still in play today. Rousseau is important not just because, philosophers like to talk about him, but because his ideas are still influencing people today. American politics, right here, right now, still influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So how do things go bad? Well, this is his claim. We create society. And somewhat ironically, society being artificial and also corrupt makes us bad. So in a way, we sort of doom ourselves. Somehow we're good. We create civilization, which is somehow bad. And it makes us corrupt. We become bad. And the story kind of goes like this. Once we have civilization, positive self-love gets turned into pride. And pride causes us to start comparing ourselves to each other. Things like, hey, Bob's got some better rocks than I do. Or, Bob's cave is nicer than my cave. And this creates fear. And then once we're afraid of other people, we can start enjoying their pain and weakness. Because when they do worse, we feel better. Or so we claim. And this is how we become unhappy. So we doom ourselves through civilization. Now this, of course, is not original to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and not unique to him. There are many tales, of course, of the fall from, a state of goodness to civilization corrupted. Now, one thing that got him in trouble, though, of course, was when he was in France, which was a Catholic nation this time, is it ran up against the idea of original sin. Because the story of original sin is, Adam and Eve created, put in the garden, and there's the tree with the apple on the tree of knowledge, and they ate it, they realized, good and evil, and poof, out of the garden, tainted with sin, etc. And of course that notion of the noble savage totally goes against that. So Rousseau got in a little bit of trouble. Now I mentioned about how he's influencing people even today, and here's one area where it applies. The notion that the city is corrupt, that the urban centers are corrupt, is one that's still embraced in American politics today. For example, if you go back in the ancient days of 2008, when John McCain and Sarah Palin were running up against Barack Obama and Joe Biden, one thing Sarah did, being an astute political philosopher, she noted, that talking about the cities, how they're corrupting, talking about in their famous, term, the real America. And real America is not in New York or Los Angeles or Hollywood. Real America is outside the city. And she might have not realized it, but she was channeling Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The idea that the city is a corrupting influence is something, laid down to Western political thought, in large part by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And even today, we have people, typically, conservatives, bring up this notion. The idea that we have the left coast and, the east and west coast, all these cities, and how I think it was Rand Paul talking about when people fly over, they look down at what they call flyover country. And the idea is that the rural folks are better than the city folks. And we still see this notion playing in politics today. Now, a fair question, of course, is that true? Are rural folks better than city folks, morally? No. One way to look at it is statistics. Interestingly, well, in a way, cities often have people that are more connected. They found you have more social connection. And in terms of the crime, we think of cities often as being super high crime, but interesting enough, one of the highest crime places in America is Alaska.
Really?
For real. Violent crimes and so forth, pretty high. I mean, you wouldn't think of it because you don't think of Alaska. You don't think of Alaska, CSI Alaska. But yeah, a lot of violent crimes. Maine, which is also pretty rural, because I'm from Maine, is low crime for whatever reason. So you have two places that are both very rural and cold, but one very low crime, one very, very high. I think Maine is 48th in terms of crime. I think the states with no populations are low because there's no people to commit crimes. And of course, cities, we think of places like Chicago with high levels of violence. But yeah, in terms of morality, it's pretty safe to say that there's no, the myth of the corrupt city and the good, rural thing is a myth. It's a fiction. so, good effort, as they say, but no. But it's a very influential point. And again, even to this day, we'll see this play out. When you have the, Democrats going up against Republicans, I'm willing to bet a fair amount that the Republican candidate will tap into that. The idea that cities are corrupt and it's the country, the rural folks that are good. Despite, the evidence that people are good and bad pretty much everywhere. The second thing, his discourse on the arts and sciences. Now what he does in this is he looks at the arts and sciences. Now, in general, if someone were to ask you, have the arts and sciences been good for humanity? Are we better off having the arts and the sciences than we would be if we didn't have them? Yeah. What have the arts and science given us?
What was that?
Well, what are the arts and science? What have they given us? What do we get?
I don't know, out of the medieval times, it's education, knowledge, basically.
Yeah, knowledge. I mean, you could, just in this room, we could point to everything in the room. Clothing, smartwatches, cheap smartwatches, nothing fancy. $89, Amazon, birthday present. But I still like it because it's a birthday present. Camera, lights. Can't see them, but vaccines. That way I don't get like polio. You don't get polio. That's good. Glasses, iPads, air conditioning. And so yeah, we generally think of arts and sciences as good because it gives us all that good stuff. And of course the arts brings us, movies and so forth. So yeah, life would be pretty boring because you wouldn't have an iPad on which to watch the movies. The sad and tragic wasteland of existence. Now, Rousseau thinks the arts and sciences have not been beneficial to us. Now, that seems like an odd thing to say, so he's got to back that up. And he gives two main arguments. Argument one. He claims that these advances come with a price. Specifically, that the development of this technology, these arts and these sciences, made governments more powerful at the expense of individual liberty. In other words, technology and advancement enables the state to rule over us. Now, he of course was writing, quite a while ago, but is that still a fair concern today? Do we worry that technology is giving the state the power to control us and spy on us, etc.? Yeah, because we had the the Snowden leaks where we said like the NSA is getting into everything, email, your phone records, apparently Yahoo web chat. They got all, not all of it, but they have like screenshots from it, those shots from it, at intervals. And interestingly, they actually had, I think it was like a British intelligence, they actually had a policy and had policies for like looking at the naked photos of people they pull off the webcams because they have all that stuff. I think one of the policies is they're not allowed to make jokes about it or print it up and post it around the office. I think that's some of the rules. Yeah, and so the government has a lot of control over us. They have cameras and killer drones and so forth. And everyone's probably seen or heard of the dystopian movies that show a future where the government controls through technology. One of the earliest ones is, of course, 1984, which most people ironically get forced to read by the state, which is kind of ironic. Or, more recently we have things like The Hunger Games, Divergent, and lots of other, Maze Runner, and it's kind of a common theme, this powerful state using technology to oppress people. And so the idea that this technology can impress us is something that's, become embedded in, fiction and literature. So that does seem to be a point of concern. The power we have is power over each other, and the state's power over us. Secondly, and somewhat ironically, is that once we get material, progression, which I don't think of that is good, like having clothing is good, watches is good, money, etc. He notes there's a cost to that as well, namely jealousy, etc. And we end up in this, competition over stuff. Because I guess, and we go way back to, the allegedly noble savage times, not a lot of possessions. But today, there's so much stuff, we can have incredible inequality, which leads to all kinds of social ills or social class. Now, there are people who have advocated, it actually has a name, the back to nature thing, that we should sort of, go off the grid, give up all this stuff. And it is a value question. Is all the stuff we got worth the price we have to pay for it? But, iPads, pretty sweet. Now, another one of his big works is the Discourse on Inequality. Now, in this one, he discusses our move from the state of nature to the state of artificial society and inequality. Because again, the good question is, if we're noble savages and we're all, good before civilization, why do we do that? Why do we doom ourselves? Well, here's his answer. He claims that the earliest humans were, and this kind of ties into modern evolutionary theory, were ape-like beings that differed from other critters in that they had free will and they could improve. So why did we end up in civilization? Well, interestingly or boringly enough, his starting point is actually something that is being supported by current research today, mostly with studies of other primates besides us, but kind of a hot thing in evolutionary theory today is that our near primate ancestors are naturally compassionate, have empathy. And his claim, which is consistent with this, is that our ancestors had a natural inclination for compassion, which is not unique to Rousseau, but it's the view, again, that we're basically not pure good, but at least we have some compassion. He does note that we do have a drive for self-preservation, but we also have a caring for others. So what happened? Well, population growth. People, more and more people, and so we ended up forming, I guess we'd form tribes and villages and, states, so cities and nations and so forth, or so he claims. And what happened is that we started to change. We became, civilized. And one change was that our well-being started to depend on how others thought of us. In other words, we started being concerned about reputation and status. And then what happened was this. Now, if you recall back to classes in history, you might recall learning about how when people discovered fire and the wheel, agriculture, had things like agriculture, growing crops, metallurgy, which is working metals, making metal tools and weapons, and private property, and the division of labor. Are those good things? Is it good we have agriculture, metal tools, and division of labor, and people owning stuff? Is that stuff good? Yeah, in fact, it's sort of the foundation of our civilization. Working metal, technology, and back in the day it was hammering out, say, arrowheads or spearheads or swords, and now our metallurgy gives us iPads. And of course we think of agriculture as good because food, not starving, is good, and we like owning stuff. Now, Rousseau lays out not the original conspiracy theory because they're any boring, but he lays out an interesting conspiracy theory, which is this. He claims that the first state was created by a social contract, created by the powerful and wealthy. And this is it was a trick. It was a trick, he claims, on the part of the powerful and wealthy to make inequality an enduring aspect of society. In other words, again, classic conspiracy. The rich and powerful got together, made up a duplicitous contract and got us to go along with it, and have kept it going all this time, that we have been deceived. And what he does in his plan is to offer an alternative to get rid of that fraudulent original contract and bring about a more equal distribution. Now this, of course, is still relevant today. For example, in the United States, we hear people on the left, like Bernie Sanders, talking about inequality and how awful that is. And then we have people who claim that inequality is a great thing, that we should have this inequality and argue against, this fight against it. And so we're we're discussing the same issue. Is inequality a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Bernie says bad thing. Trump says good. And so in 2016, we'll get a chance to vote on that particular thing. So we'll end with inequality, and next time we'll pick up with the social contract, and then some education with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then more stuff, and then more stuff, and then it'll all right. Going to class, but eventually everything will